Hello everyone and welcome. We are so happy to be learning with you here again at Drisha. But some of us might be feeling a little bit sad because this is the final session of the very special course, Resurrection and Reincarnation, Two Central Jewish Teachings and Their Meanings for Today, with Dr. Nathaniel Berman. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to be a panelist. And this just means that you can show us your smiling faces if you want to, and you will be able to unmute when Dr. Berman invites questions or comments. When you're not speaking, we just ask you to keep yourself on mute so that we don't hear too much background noise and we can hear each other. You can put comments and questions in the chat box as we go, and if you're joining us on Facebook Live, if you comment on the live video, I can bring those comments to Dr. Berman. Over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the sixth and last session of this course. I was telling Noah before we started that the last session of a course always makes me very sad. And I taught the last class of my semester at Brown this morning. And I told them a story, which I often retell, that when I was in college, which was quite some time ago, I took a course on existentialism with a wonderful professor named Maurice Nathanson, of blessed memory. And he, existentialism, like all great thought, is focuses on two topics: love and death, which basically all thought focuses on. And as a 19 or 20-year-old, I was mostly interested in love and not so much in death. And existentialism talks a lot about death, and I thought, oh, let's go on, let's get to the love and sex and romance part. But in the last class, he looked at us. He was probably in his late 60s at the time. He looked at us and he said, the end of a course is like a little death. We did what we did in this room. We will never be again in this group. Some of you may take courses with me again. You may see me on campus, but as a group, this is what we did. We're mortal, finite beings. We had a particular amount of time together. This is what we did. And it really blew me away, and it echoed back to me decades later when I started teaching, and always felt the sadness at the end of a course. And then I thought of Professor Nathanson's comments. This is many years later, and I still remember it decades later. I can actually picture the classroom where he said it so many decades later. It was very, very, very big influence on me. And so I always get a little sad at the end. It really is like a little sign of our mortality that we have a course that lasts a certain amount of time and not more time. So with that somber note, let's plunge back into our topic, which is, right now we're in the second half of the course on gilgul, or reincarnation as it's sometimes translated, or as I like to translate it, the revolution of souls. And we're going to talk about a couple of things tonight. One is continuing this theme of ibbur, and also then shift to talking about the relationship between gilgul in the human plane and what is amazingly and perhaps somewhat astonishingly gilgul in the divine plane in Kabbalah. And so the second half of tonight's class, I'm going to shift you into deep into the Kabbalistic deep end of Kabbalah. I don't expect you all to get it if you've never been exposed to it before, but it'll be a taste of things to come if I offer a class again, or somebody else offers a class in Kabbalah. Sort of an intriguing element where a canonical Kabbalistic text talks about gilgul in the divine realm, which is really an amazing and astonishing thing. but we'll see why it's so important for our themes as we go along. And one of our themes has been love, actually. So the basic themes of love and death. This course is a lot about death, but it's also about love. And when we talked about Tchiat HaMetim, we saw how many of our texts talked about Tchiat HaMetim as love and as an embrace. And we saw the resurrection of the dead by Elisha, for example, as an embrace. And then the Zohar really picked that up and talked about the name Habakkuk as a double embrace. So without further ado, let's go to the PowerPoint and resume our discussion. And here we're going to talk about, so let's start. Ibbur is love. So remember, ibbur is soul pregnancy. It's when a sort of a spirit guide comes into a living person during the course of their lifetime to help them on to the next level. And one of the astonishing things is this, that although we usually talk about ibbur as a form of gilgul, it's a form of reincarnation in the sense that a dead soul comes into a living body, it turns out this is a form of reincarnation that can happen when the entering soul is from a person who's still alive. And here we have really this connection between ibbur and love. So listen to this. So again, usually it's someone who's dead, their soul comes into the body of a living person during their lifetime to help guide them. Okay. And then there is this special case that he talks about, that Chaim Vital talks about, in which it's the soul of a living person, or at least part of a soul of a living person. And here's what he says. So again, this is Chaim Vital, the great 16th century Kabbalist, the principal student of Isaac Luria, the Ari, who revolutionized Kabbalah in Sfat, in Safed, in the middle of the 16th century. And Chaim Vital was the main redactor of his teachings. Okay, this is what he says. It is also possible that the righteous person, in other words, his guide, his spirit guide that we talked about last time, is with him during his lifetime. In other words, alive at the same time as him, and yet be an ibbur within him. When this person, in other words, the person who needs a guide, does a mitzvah that is associated with this righteous person, then the nefesh of the righteous person will come as an ibbur in him, even though they are alive at the same time. So now here we have the idea, if the whole idea of gilgul and ibbur that I've been stressing for the last two classes is about getting away from the hermetically sealed self, right? And so that ibbur and gilgul, they're the opposite of, I was the Queen of England in a past life. It's the opposite of a sort of a narcissistic idea about reincarnation, which is all about the continuation of one hermetically sealed self and the career of the self. It's really about a collective project, right? Here we have a kind of reincarnation of a living person into a living person to come as a spirit guide within them. Okay, I just want to let that sink in for a second. And here's the example, and then this is astonishing example that Chaim Vital gives. This is the mystery of the verse, talking about from the story of the famous friendship of David and Jonathan. David, Jonathan, the son of King Saul. David, this young upstart who Saul becomes very jealous of and who eventually becomes king in place of Saul. And he says, this is the mystery of the verse, the nefesh of David cleaved to the nefesh of Jonathan. While they were both alive together, the nefesh of David was an ibbur within Jonathan. And by the way, I put verse in quotation marks because there is no such verse, actually. There's a verse that's very similar to it, but either Chaim Vital is intentionally changing the verse or this is how he remembers it. The verse actually says it in the opposite direction. It actually says Jonathan's soul was bound to David's soul. And he remembers it in this other way. He invents a verse. Actually, people can follow the Hebrew. He quotes a verse that says, Batidbak nefesh David bihonatan. And the verse is not that. But in any event, he changes the verse to make it like an ibbur. The nefesh of David cleaved to the nefesh of Jonathan In other words, the nefesh of David came into Jonathan during their lifetime. And it's here where you can really see how ibbur is a form of love, and maybe gilgul as well. Now, of course, the friendship of David and Jonathan is a very famous topic of discussion. It's a very intense thing in the Tanakh because Jonathan is King Saul's son, and David, seems to be usurping the kingdom from him, and they have this intense friendship. Meanwhile, David marries Jonathan's sister, and there seems to be a very, very intense emotional relationship going on between David and the children of Saul. And of course, in more recent times, people talk about it in terms of, was there a homoerotic dimension to their friendship? And that's a big topic of conversation in the last number of decades. But here's an image of their friendship from a 13th century French manuscript that I found online. And it's really, quite an amazing portrait that really does perhaps stress the homoerotic nature of their friendship. David is clearly the one on the left because he's wearing a crown. And then there's Saul, and it's clearly something very, very intense. Whether it's erotic or not erotic is for you to decide. But this idea that the fact that this is the example, this is the sole example that Chaim Vital gives of this ibbur during the lifetime of both people, both the impregnating soul and the impregnated person, is this friendship between David and Jonathan. And it really is ibbur as love. And again, love is probably the experience that we all have where we really are. We really experience the permeability of ourselves, and we have an intertwining, a spiritual intertwining with someone else. That's what we call love, really. And he really captures something here, I think, Chaim Vital, by giving this as the example. Now, let's take a deep breath, because I'm going to shift a little bit. Take one deep breath. Okay. I sent this out in an email after last class, but I thought we should look at it together. This was in response to somebody asked a question that we had, the text seemed to suggest that ibbur was something that you could induce. You could induce the spirit of a spirit guide to enter you through doing certain kinds of rituals or performances or good deeds. And it seemed to be a practice designed for those who are really expert in kabbalistic ritual. And somebody asked the question, well, this seems to be more suited for someone who's incapable, who's in distress, who really isn't a kabbalistic expert, but somebody who's really in spiritual distress. And the person said, well, is that mentioned in the text? And at the time, I think I was tired or something. I said, well, not really. But then as soon as the class was over, I thought, no, that's not right. And there's actually a long passage in another 16th century text called the Sefer Haridim, also written in Sfat at the same time by Elazar Askiri. And the discussion there is very long. And what I found was a summary of it in a much later text, late 19th century Hasidic text by the so-called Danziger, the Alexander Rebbe, Rabbi Yerachmael Yisrael Yitzchak Danziger, in his book Sefer Yismach Yisrael, and he's quoting this 16th century book, the Sefer Haridim. And this is what he says. And I emailed this, but I thought we should look at it together. A person who wishes to return in tshuva, repentance, and to turn to goodness, but this person is incapable of doing so. So this is exactly the question that was asked of me. Due to being overwhelmed by their inclination, and usually when they say the inclination, it means the evil inclination, they send to that person from the heavens, in the dimension of ibbur, of the soul pregnancy, the soul of a righteous person who had guided many in their lifetime. And the Hebrew is who had brought many to merit, mezaket harabim, to help the person to return in tshuva. And if, God forbid, actually the literal translation of chas v'shalom is pity and peace. the person is so sullied and degraded that the soul of a righteous person would not help them. They send to that person the soul of our master Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, peace be unto him, whose expansiveness is in every generation to help that person. And this is the mystery of ibbur. So in this text, ibbur, according to the Alexander, ibbur is specifically, principally, for the kind of case that the questioner asked about, which is to help someone who is actually in distress and is feeling helpless to move forward, not a kabbalistic expert, but someone who's really in distress. And it says they sent him from heaven the soul of a righteous person. And if that doesn't work, the most righteous person of all, Moses. Okay. Now somebody asked me when I sent out the email, they said, who's the they here? Well, good question, right? This phrase, they send to that person from heavens, that locution really comes from the Talmud. There's a Talmudic saying that says, someone who comes to purify themselves, they help him from heaven. And the they is sort of left undefined, some kind of perhaps angelic messengers, some kind of heavenly forces. And here it becomes about this ibbur, which of course is not mentioned in the Talmud because it only develops later. Right. And this idea of Moses, there's a lot in the classical Kabbalistic sources in the 13th and 14th century about the notion that Moses is always present in every generation and has a gilgul in every generation. And the Aramaic here that I've translated, whose expansiveness is in every generation, the Aramaic is itpashtute v'chol dara, and well, except for the people for whom Aramaic is their native language, that probably didn't help that much. But the idea is that some kind of spark of Moses appears in every generation. And it also has a kind of a messianic implication that one of those sparks will eventually become the Messiah at the proper time. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are questions, because then we're going to shift gears. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. And let's see if we have any questions. Somebody had their hand up? Who was that? Yeah, Al.
In order to follow these concepts, I'm trying to release the idea that a neshama has a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, or a nefesh, or neshama, that these are more expanding than one nefesh of one person, sort of like an entity with defined boundaries goes into another. And I'm thinking that it can exist expansively and also seep into someone. And that helps me. That's one way that I'm, and I hope that I'm on the right track.
I'm sure you're on the right track, Gail. I mean, I would say this, right, is that one of the main things I try to convey in teaching these ideas is to appeal to your experience, or to try to induce people to imagine what it would be like to treat these things as something we can experience, or in fact do experience, rather than as a supernatural thing that's interestingly exotic, but what has no relationship to anything in our lives. And so I've tried to, a lot of the texts I gave, let's say in our first session on gilgul, were really about what it would be like to wander around the hills and have your teacher say, look at that stone, there's a gilgul of so-and-so from the time of the Talmud in that stone, as Yitzhak Luria would say to his student Chaim Vital. And part of the reason why so here I'm stressing this idea of ibbur as love, because love is an experience that most of us have had, the experience of loving somebody or being loved by somebody. And there certainly is a certain kind of permeability of selves in love. If it's really an intense love relationship, there is a certain kind of overlapping, melding. People have all different kinds of experience of love. Of course, the physical act of love obviously involves some kind of physical intertwining, but also a spiritual intertwining if it's really an act of love. And that's an experience we all have. Well, I hope we all have. Some of people in this room, as I said last time, have had the experience of being pregnant, right? And that's actually a literal example, a very, very literal example of one human being having another human being inside of them. I haven't had that privilege of having an actual physical experience, but I imagine that some people in this call have had that experience. And that's, it's not incidental that they took this word ibbur as pregnancy to describe this experience. That's the word they chose. And there are texts where, that it's explicitly, it's like a woman being pregnant. That's what it's like, right? And all kinds of gender shifting, the Kabbalist as, again, primarily, these are books written by men for men, and the Kabbalist imagining himself as a woman being impregnated by a soul of a righteous person. So the boundary shifting, right? The notion that boundaries are permeable is really at the heart of all these teachings about gilgul and ibbur. And I think they do correspond a lot to our experience of everyday life, right? Having a teacher, having a lover, having a parent, of having a child, right? It is really part of our experience. And whereas the idea of the hermetically sealed off self is actually more like an ideology than an experience. Or we only have that experience at bad times when we're really lonely. Loneliness, which is not a good thing, a bad experience, right? That's when we're really the sealed off self. And yet Western philosophy from the Enlightenment on took that experience as the paradigm, but it really isn't the paradigm. It's a deficient case. Beth?
I really love the idea of that there can be an ibbur of someone else's soul while that person is still alive. And I was so delighted when it turned out that the paradigmatic example of that was David and Jonathan, because I was thinking in terms of soulmates who marry each other and who work towards helping each other be their highest, best self, their most righteous self, their most loving self. And I was also thinking about really close best friends and the way they help each other develop. And then the next slide, David and Jonathan. Yeah. So that was really sweet.
Yeah. And, and also there's a certain kind of, as so often in friendship, a certain kind of asymmetry. Often friendships are not symmetrical, that, they're not, they very, very often, there's somebody who wants it more than the other, or somebody who's, guiding more than the other. This book, Shar Gilgulim, is filled with dramas, some very, very, very edgy dramas that arise in ibbur, and I've spared that stuff because that would, we only have a few classes together. I want to give you the good side, not the bad side. But there is a lot of that in it as well, of those kinds of dramas. Okay, so let's Sharon.
Just continuing that note, I was actually wondering, is there a reciprocity in that example? It was the ibbur of David was in Jonathan, but it doesn't say the reverse. It doesn't say that the ibbur of Jonathan was in David. You were talking about the inequality in friendships. Right. Is that not the case? Does it talk about, or is that just assumed reciprocity?
No, I think one of the great things I like about Chaim Vital's descriptions here are they're very human. How often is any relationship truly equal? And certainly the paradigm is not this during the lifetime ibbur, but the ibbur of a dead soul into a living person. And there it's quite clear that the dead righteous person is a spirit guide. And there's also a lot of descriptions about how they don't necessarily stay. If the person then, deteriorates or gets corrupted, the ibbur says, I'm out of here, and leaves. And basically it's really that the person who needs the ibbur has to really, concentrate and live up to that spirit guide, otherwise spirit guide leaves. So there's a lot of asymmetries and dramas, very, very human dramas. And I think I said, did I say it or didn't I say that it's very novelistic, this book? It's all about these dramas between these people coming in and going out. And Jeffrey, I see you over here.
Yeah, so if experiencing this is necessary for acceptance, how is it likely or possible, or how do you account for the fact that somebody actually experiences this? In other words, if I was so fortunate that some spark from Moses came in to guide me, how would I know that?
Well, that's a great, I think it's a really important question. And again, I think I may have said that I think one of the things the Kabbalists are trying to induce through their teaching and writing is a raised level of consciousness, a raised level of awareness. And maybe I should bring these repeated quotes in the Zohar, people are living and they have no idea what's around them. They have no idea what's going on. It's kind of like when Hamlet says to Horatio, there are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And there are constant passages, proclamations in the Zohar, making that same point, although in 13th century Aramaic. And I think it's really about this. I think this is about this experience of this raised awareness. The experience that I think many of us have is when you all of a sudden become aware that you're speaking like your parent. And it often happens to people, not a little bit later in life. They'll say, "Oh my God, I just sound exactly like my father or my mother or whoever." I was at a family simcha, family celebration last night, and I remembered my mother. My mother had like 7 uncles, and they were, these very charismatic figures, the children of immigrants. Anyway, I won't go to the whole family story, but they were these the uncles were these very charismatic figures. And I heard stories about them. Most of them had died before I was born, but I heard stories about them. My mother told me that once she was sitting with her sister at a family event, a family celebration, all the uncles are long gone. She looks at her sister and she said, "We're the uncles." And I think it wasn't just a comment that they were now the oldest generation. It really was inhabiting that position that those uncles had. And I think we all have that experience in one way or another. Okay, I'm going to go on to this other mind-blowing thing that we're going to do now, which is introduced by the idea gilgul as the utopian perfection of humanity as a whole and of the divine. And that I've been anticipating a lot throughout our discussion of gilgul. So this is again from the Tikkun Zohar, which is, let me get rid of these controls. They're in my way. I don't know if you can see them, but they're in my way. I'm sorry. This is from the Midrash. So this is the idea of the unity of humanity. And this is this incredible Midrash that's found in Shemot Rabbah. It's also in the Tanhuma. And I'm just giving you a little excerpt from it. But the Kabbalists were very taken with this Midrash. So this is a very old Midrash, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. And it goes like this. Well, the first Adam, Adam Harishon, I'm not really sure how to translate Adam Harishon, but the first Adam, the first human being, was still arrayed as an inert body. Now remember, God like forms Adam out of clay, right? And then he breathes a soul into him. So this apparently happens this very strange phrase, mutal golem, which I don't know if it occurs anywhere except in this midrash. But anyway, this is how I translate it. Well, the first Adam was still arrayed as an inert body, a golem, and a golem not in the later Maralmi Prague sense, but in the terms of a just matter, passive body, inert body. The Blessed Holy One showed him each and every righteous person that would emerge from him. There were those who hung from the head of Adam. There were those who hung from his hair. There were those who hung from his forehead, from his eyes, from his nose, and from his earlobes. And this midrash exists in several different versions in various midrashic collections. The word I translated as hung can also mean depended. But I think I left hung rather than depended because there really is a physical sense here of all the people, all the righteous people. I'm not sure, we could wonder about why it doesn't say every person, every human being, but every righteous person are all incorporated in the body of the first Adam. So the first Adam contains, in a way, all of humanity, or at least all of righteous humanity, probably all of humanity. Again, not completely clear why it says every righteous person. They're all part of Adam's body, and the physical image, different parts of Adam's body contain different souls, future souls to be born from him. Okay, now remember back to our first session on reincarnation, on Gilgul, the passage in the Tikkunei Zohar that talked about the perfection of the human body through the performance of mitzvot, and that if you don't perfect your body entirely through the performance of mitzvot in one lifetime, you have to come back in another lifetime in order to perfect the body. Remember that? Well, this midrash, which becomes very influential, and I'll show you in a second, suggests, if you read this midrash together with that passage from the Tikkunei Zohar, that it's the collective body of humanity that needs to be perfected, not the individual body. It's the collective body. And that really is the teaching, the core teaching of the Tikkunei Zohar about Gilgul. But first, before we get back to the Tikkunei Zohar, it was a nice summary that I found in a 17th century kabbalistic work called Emek HaMelech by Naftali Hertz Bakrach, who was, for people who know who Bert Bacharach was, the singer, he was a distant descendant from this 17th century Kabbalist. And this is sort of this idea is it's already in 13th, 14th century Kabbalistic works. It's just a nice summary of it that I found in the 17th century work. All souls hang from the first Adam, and he must heal them, for he damaged them through his sin. And this is a core idea certainly in Lurianic Kabbalah, but it really originates in the Zohar in the 13th century, that the first sin of the first human being or human beings caused damage to the cosmos and caused damage to all of humanity that needs to be repaired, that needs tikkun through the generations. And here, if you combine this idea with the Midrash, you see why, right? That all of humanity is connected. All souls hang from the first Adam. We have that in the Midrash, composed about more than 1,000 years before this text. And he must heal them, for he damaged them through his sin. Now he says he must heal them. Well, Adam's been long dead. So it turns out to be through his gilgulim, through his transmigrations or reincarnations. And therefore our sages said in the Talmud, this is a very enigmatic statement in the Talmud. The Son of David, the Messiah, will only come when all the souls in the body have been completed. And so that's a statement in the Talmud. And it's a little bit unclear what the Talmudic meant, that statement meant in its Talmudic context. But whatever it meant in its Talmudic context, it's quite clear how the Kabbalists understood it. All the souls in the body of the first Adam need to be completed, for they depend on him for healing. So all the souls are connected to Adam's body, and they all need to have tikkun in order, and when that happens, the Messiah will come. So this is this very explicit connection between gilgul and a messianic vision. That gilgul, far from being a narcissistic thing about the self, it's really about humanity as a whole, and it actually has a very, very strong messianic component. Okay, now, for people who have taken any course in Kabbalah before, you're familiar with this diagram, and for people who haven't, well, hello, Kabbalah. This is the Kabbalistic image of the divine realm, called the 10 sefirot, these 10 structures or archetypes that compose the divine realm and are really sort of the DNA of all of being. And I'm not going to go through it all right now, but it just thought I'd show you, since this is a course that has a strong Kabbalistic dimension. How could I not show this diagram to you? For people who are interested in diagrams, an amazing book just was published by an Israeli scholar named Yossi Chayes, C-H-A-J-E-S, on the unbelievably complicated and beautiful and intriguing diagrams that Kabbalists drew and designed over the ages. So it's called the Kabbalistic Tree. Just came out. It's a really beautiful book. Anyway, this is a very simple version of it. There are these 10 structures, 10 sefirot, right? And within the 10 sefirot, there are various divine personae. And for people who've never studied Kabbalah before, all this will sound very heretical and very wild. And you should have that experience. But we're not going to dwell on it right now. You're just going to take my word for it. So this one here, Chochmah, the second one on the right, is called the supernal father, Abba Ilah. This one on the left, Bina, is called the supernal mother, Ima Ilah. Right here, Chesed, the one on the right, is associated with Abraham, but now Abraham not as that human being who wandered around in Mesopotamia and Canaan so long ago, but now Abraham as a divine persona within this realm. Gvura on the left is associated with Isaac, and here again, as a divine persona. And Tiferet, this middle one, is associated with Jacob. Okay, if you've never had any exposure to Kabbalah, all this will sound like, might sound to you like it can't possibly be Judaism, but take my word for it. This is this Kabbalistic basics that most Jews took as the center of their religion for several centuries. So just take my word for it right now, because now we're going to work with it. So right, we have father, mother, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, now back to Adam for a second. Okay, this is from the Tikkun HaZohar. This is work that we've talked about before, early 14th century, written in Aramaic, is written a little bit after the main body of the Zohar, and it is partly an imitation of the Zohar, partly a pastiche of it, and partly very different, both in style and content. And the Tikkun HaZohar is very, very, very much concerned with gilgul. And here we have the gilgul of Adam. Adam sinned in thought and action. And therefore, when Adam revolved, when he went through gilgul, galgel, in Abraham, he was tested with 10 tests. And we'll leave out that 10 thing for a second. It's complicated to explain. And because he sinned with action, when he revolved in Isaac, he was tested in action. So there's a midrash that says that God tested Abraham not only with the binding of Isaac, but there were 10 tests that God tested Abraham with. And Isaac obviously tested in action because he was the object of the binding of Isaac. Now, the plain meaning of this, Adam sinned in thought and action, is both in deed and intent, in intent and deed, thought and action. So here, the idea is, in order to have tikkun for that sin, first, there was gilgul in Abraham to heal or do tikkun on the sin in thought. Then there was tikkun, then had gilgul in Isaac to heal, to tikkun on his sin in action. Okay. But thought and action are also names for these two divine structures, chokhmah and bina, wisdom and understanding, associated with the sphirot, with the personae of the divine father and mother. Jacob comprised both. From the dimension of Isaac, he was called Jacob. From the dimension of Abraham, he was called Israel. So the tikkun first had to happen on the side of Abraham, associated with mercy, and on the side of Isaac, associated with judgment, and then with Jacob, who combines both. Okay. And on the human level, Adam had a gilgul in Abraham, then a gilgul in Isaac, then a gilgul in Jacob. And the passage actually goes on to say it then continued up until the generation that stood before Mount Sinai, the 600,000 who stood before Sinai, and that was the ultimate gilgul of Adam in those 600,000, when there was the complete tikkun. And that is an idea that is inherited from the Talmud, that at Sinai, the sin of Adam was finally remedied. And that's actually in the Talmud, although in the Talmud they don't talk about gilgul in that connection. And then the Talmud goes on and says, and then they sinned with the golden calf, so the damage came back and the whole thing had to start all over again. And that idea is very much in the Tikkun Hazor. So Adam sins, the purification, the tikkun of that sin has to happen through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and on through the generations up to the 600,000 that stood at Sinai. And then the sin happened, and then more tikkun had to happen. So this idea that the tikkun of this one person, Adam, then became the project of humanity as a whole. Right? And that's the thing that I've been stressing, that gilgul is really not about the individual. It's really a collective project in so many different ways that we've seen. More than one gilgul in a person, an ibbur in a person, living, dead. And here we have it as a way of understanding history, of situating yourself in history. That entire human history is this process of tikkun. And the tikkun will not be completed until it's completed in everyone. And that is the Messianic era. So gilgul as a collective project and as a Messianic project. Okay, now that's not radical enough for the Tikkun Hazor. So now the passage shifts with barely signaling that it's shifted. It shifts into the divine realm. And it says, for father revolve in Abraham, who is to the right, and mother in Isaac, who is to the left. Jacob includes both father and mother. Now here, there is no question that the text now is shifting to talk about the divine realm, and it talks about the unfolding of the divine realm, which is sometimes referred to as the emanation of the sphirot, in terms of gilgul, that there's some kind of process of purification in the divine realm, just as there is in the history of humanity. And this is, I say, we're coming to the end of our course. I'm giving you one of the most radical ideas that Kabbalists ever came up with to give you a taste to continue studying Kabbalah. Because if this is the first time you're being exposed to it, I hope you're having an experience of shock and thinking, oh my God, this doesn't sound like Judaism. But really, this is one of the most radical ideas I've ever found in a Kabbalistic text. And it shifts as though it's like, it doesn't even signal the shift. For father revolve in Abraham, who is to the right, mother in Isaac, who is to the left. Jacob includes both father and mother. And then the very next line, now when it says Adam, it means both the human Adam and the divine Adam. Because it also talks about this idea of a supernal Adam, Adam Ilah. And when Adam came, he was purified in Abraham, and his roots spread on the earth. And the mystery of the matter is, this verse from Proverbs, from Mishlei, the crucible is for purifying silver, and the furnace for gold, but Hashem tests the heart. The crucible is for purifying silver. This is Abraham. So Abraham is the crucible for a certain kind of purification of Adam. The furnace for gold, for purifying gold. This is Isaac. Isaac is a furnace for purifying Adam in a different way. And Hashem tests the heart. This is Jacob. So Jacob serves to purify Adam in yet a third way. There is no sphira in which supernal Adam, and that's clearly the divine Adam, did not come in gilgul to purify and cleanse human Adam, whom he created in his image below and emanated his emanation in him. And all the effort above for human Adam was only for the sake of the emanation of Adam above, for each depends upon the other. And I don't want to take questions of it. I do want to just say a couple of things, because this is probably one of the most radical ideas that you could find in Kabbalah. This idea that the divine needs purification. And you find this idea, it's in the Zohar, it's in the Tikkunei Zohar, it becomes very, very explicit in Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century. This idea that just as the history of humanity is the history of a collective project of purification because of the original sin, so in the divine realm, there's the process of divine unfolding is not a smooth linear thing. It's a process of purification of the divine. Why does the divine need purification? That's a whole other course. Maybe it's because Adam damaged it through his sin. That's one Kabbalistic answer. A more esoteric Kabbalistic answer is though the first thing is not esoteric. A more esoteric Kabbalistic answer is that the divine needs catharsis. And this idea becomes very explicit in certain texts from the Lurianic school in the 16th century, but is really present already in the Zohar and in the Tikkunei Zohar. Very radical. And if you follow that passage that I just read very closely, it really talks about, here going back to the question about reciprocity before, there's a reciprocity between human purification and divine purification. But the purpose of human purification is to purify the divine, again suggesting perhaps that the divine needed purification because of human sin. And the purpose of divine unfolding is for the sake of human beings. So there's a reciprocity between the human and the divine. That is a classic Kabbalistic idea that is found in almost all Kabbalistic texts, certainly once the Zohar is written. This idea of the reciprocity between human and divine, the capacity of human beings both to damage the divine and heal the divine. So the idea of tikkun, which is an old word in Jewish tradition from rabbinic times, where it mostly means really about, making sure the world's a good place, an orderly place, takes on this mystical meaning in Kabbalah as the tikkun of the divine. And that's what you have here, that gilgul in human beings is not only about the perfection of humanity as a whole, as though that were not enough, it's also about the perfection of the divine itself.
But Dr. Berman, I don't think that this extraordinarily complex schema that you have so well explained is part of Kabbalah. I've read a great deal about Kabbalah. I've never seen anything similar to what you just outlined.
It pours off every single page. And I'll give you, as I say, I could give you the 3 volumes of the Zohar, and I would challenge you to open up a page where I wouldn't find this idea. Open up a page at random, I'll find the idea on that page. But rather than doing that kind of thing, let me just give you a very easy example. There's the Kabbalists say kavanot before they do any ritual performance, an intention to orient themselves into what they're about to do. And the classic Kabbalistic kavanah, the formula they say before doing any ritual performance, begins as follows: L'shem yichud kuchavrichu shchinte, for the sake of the unification of the Blessed Holy One and his Shekhinah. Right? And then it goes on and says, Liachta Shem Yud He B'Vav He. To unite the first two letters of the tetragrammaton, the Yud He, with the second two letters of the tetragrammaton Vav He. What does that formula mean? It means that through our performance of a mitzvah or some kind of ritual or good deed, we are bringing about the reunification of the divine. And that is said, it's a standard Kabbalistic kavanah that somebody living Kabbalistically will say before every single ritual performance, that the whole purpose of Judaism is for the reunification of the divine, which has become sundered. Just take my word for it on this. I can, but that's just an example, because that's a very common. That is the Kabbalistic kavanah. They all start off that way, and it goes very deep. That formula really comes from the Tikkunei HaZohar. Becomes standard sort of more in the 16th, 17th century, especially in a work called Sharei Tzion in the early 17th century. But the idea really comes from the Zohar, and that even phrasing, Kuchabrichush comes from the Tikkunei HaZohar itself. Okay, let me just, I see we only have 10 minutes left, so let me just, because, so this thing I just described, again, is I want you to take it with you, and give you a thirst for more Kabbalistic study. It's the ultimate radicalization of the idea of gilgul as a collective project. It's really about the cosmos as a whole, including the divine. And I thought I would finish the course. Oh, there's this. Okay, now this is also in the Tikkunei HaZohar. And it's an image of what gilgul is like, and you'll see why I wanted to give it in a second. Oops, sorry. And it compares gilgul to a tree. Like a tree olden of days, its branches desiccated. They pruned it, and it blossomed from its roots. For new branches sprang from it, just as it was in its youth. So this is an image of gilgul, that you cut off the branches, and presumably that's an image of death. And then new branches spring forth, but from the same roots. That's one of the parables or images that the Tikkunei HaZohar gives to try to understand gilgul. Like the pruning of a tree, and then new branches grow from the roots. And then, in the second half of this sentence, this is just that one sentence you see on top, written in Aramaic, right? The second half of it, oh no, actually it's a different part of it. On the next page, the very next lines are, yeah, I don't know if you can see these controls or not, but they get in my way. And this tree, what is this tree that we talked about? Is none other than the supernal Adam. That is this divine figure, of whom it is said, for the Adam is the tree of the field. Now that verse is familiar to some of you because it's often used by people who try to find ecological teachings in the Torah. Adam ki Adam etz hasadeh. Whatever it means in its biblical context, we can leave that aside for now. Here they're using it as Ha'adam really should be translated as the human being. But the Tikkunei HaZohar takes this very hyper literally, the Adam. And here they say that this Adam, who is this Adam? It's the supernal Adam, the divine Adam. So for the Adam is the tree of the field, that the divine is like a tree, and the Sfirot, the world of the Sfirot, is often compared to a tree. And this idea that there is a process of gilgul, there's a process of aging and desiccation, and then pruning and reblossoming. And it's going here, it's very clear that the text is intending this to apply both to human gilgul, right? People die and then they are revolved, have gilgul in some other generation. And then the very next sentence, very surprising and radical and sort of shocking, this idea that this also applies to the divine. And there's so much one could say about this, but But I'm not going to say anything more about it because we only have 5 minutes left in the course, and I wanted to end with this. This is a psalm that is familiar to many of you because it is the end of the psalm that we recite on Shabbat. We recite it several times. We recite it on Friday night. We recite it a couple of times on Saturday morning. And there's a very beautiful tune to these verses that I won't sing, but some of you may know that there's a beautiful song attached to it. And this is how it goes. The righteous man, this is from the Psalms, this is from the Bible. The righteous man springs up like the palm tree, like the Lebanon cedar he towers. So this is the image of a person as a tree. And I think that the Tikkun Azor is also partly drawing on this psalm. Planted in the house of Hashem, in the courts of our Elohim, they flourish. They bear fruit still in old age. Fresh and full of sap they are, to tell that Hashem is upright, my rock, and there is no iniquity in him. This image that the righteous, even though they're in old age, they then will bear fruit and they will be fresh and full of sap, sort of like full of moisture, the opposite of desiccated. Deshenim v'ra'ananim is the image here, right? And it's quite clear that the Tikkun Azor, in using the tree imagery, partly has these lines in mind, although I don't know if they actually refer to them, but other texts about gilgul do. Perhaps more obvious, and then I want to bring this back to the first part of the course, is the resurrection of the dead. So this is a text from the Zohar, using this verse from Psalms. Planted in the house of Hashem at the time of King Messiah, Melech HaMashiach, in the court of our Elohim they will blossom at the time of the resurrection of the dead. They bear fruit still in old age and the day of the destruction of the world. So they're giving various stages of the end of days, coming the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the destruction of the old world, and then fresh and full of sap they will be afterwards, as it is written, the new heaven and the new earth. So here we have these verses referring to a tree and the renewal of a tree, which is an amazing mystical vision in the psalm itself, and the Zohar just transporting it to the end of days and to this image of those who've become old and died, then being renewed at the time of the resurrection of the dead. And not only will they become fresh and full of sap, but the cosmos itself. So here we have the resurrection of the dead, not only of human beings, but of the heaven and earth themselves, quoting this amazing verse from Isaiah about the new heaven and the new earth from this chapter in Isaiah that we read on Rosh Chodesh. And I thought for the final text, so an amazing vision. And I was tempted to stop here, but I couldn't help just going back to this. I'm not sure why, but I wanted to go back to this. And here is the mystery of the bird's nest, of which it was said, thou shalt send away the mother, and she goes away wandering from her nest. And this Tikkun Azor takes this bird, this mother, both as an image of the soul going in gilgul, and also the image of the Shekhinah who goes into exile. And that's an image that we already have in rabbinic writings, corresponding to the 3 sendings away of Noah's dove. And when she found a place to dwell therein, it was said, and she returned no more to him. In other words, no more exile, no more gilgul, but finding a place of rest. And it's here that I will stop. So that is what I have to say about resurrection and reincarnation in 6 sessions. And I hope you take it away with you and do it at home. This is the kind of thing that's been the stress all along, is do it at home. See if you can put these teachings into practice or bring these teaching into your awareness. I see 8:59, and I am happy to stay on the screen for as long as Trisha keeps the window open and as long as anyone wants to talk. So Noah, over to you.
So I'll just make some announcements for people leaving, and then we of course have time for questions. First of all, I just want to thank Dr. Berman and all the participants for making this such an incredible course. This was the last session of this class for the term, but we still have more than a dozen classes throughout this week. We're finishing very strong. Additionally, Drisha will be having a 1-week Winter Zman later in December. You can learn more and sign up at winter.drisha.org. And now I'll hand over for some questions.
The floor is open. Or maybe we're all floored.
I'm certainly floored, and I want to thank you for a terrific experience. But I'm still bothered by the thought that this, as well as Kabbalah, by the way, might be examples of unconstrained model building. These are models. Let's face it. These are models. They're fascinating models. How do you verify models? Well, I don't think one can verify these things. I think that many of us, I'm sure there are only very few people who have stuck it out to the end, but I'm sure that everyone who stuck it out, and I certainly myself have the experience of being guided in some way by some outside influence. But I don't know how one can really verify this extraordinarily complex scheme that you have so expertly shown us. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
I really appreciate your comments, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for those really kind words. I really appreciate it. One of the things I've been trying to stress all along is to try to find a way, try to find some resonance in our experiences, right, of these kinds of ideas. And I think that a lot of the texts do that well. Certainly the texts about death and resurrection, and that focus that comes really is in rabbinic writings of looking at death as part of not a one-time experience, but it's certainly something one experiences every morning. One experiences resurrection. And I stress that in that part of the course, the Modeh Ani, one of the most famous prayers in our liturgy that we teach little kids. I'm not really sure why we teach to little kids. It's really about death. But anyway, one of the most famous, for often the first prayer that a child learns says, every morning I'm resurrected. And that kind of stress is in the rabbinic texts, right? Maybe, one could well argue, even in the Bible itself, this notion that an awareness of death and life, maybe not resurrection so much in the Bible, but the integrating of an awareness of death into life is certainly in many of the Psalms and all over the Bible. In rabbinic writings, this idea that death and resurrection happen all the time, and I think what they're doing there is they're because the doctrine of resurrection of the dead at the end of days was so important to them, so central to them. I think in part they were trying to do what I was trying to do in this course, is give you a sense of what it would be like to live with that sense by trying to experience it every morning, or maybe even the opposite. Maybe the reason why Resurrection of the Dead was so important to them was because they did experience it, but probably the first way. There's not only the Modeh Ani, but there's another prayer as well, the Elohai Neshama, which is another prayer that's recited every morning, which you say, "My God, the soul that you placed in me is pure," and it goes on and says, you're in the future, you will take it from me and return it to me in the future time, in other words, in the messianic time. And then it ends, but it's really to be said every morning. It's from the Talmud and says you should say this every morning, and it really is that same idea. And
Well,
then the
you,
and
you,
then the
you- you're,
line
cer-
from
you're
the
certainly convincing about resurrection.
yeah.
I think that's pretty convincing. But what I'm not totally in tune with is this concept of others entering my soul and
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's
there, I think, and then that's why I appeal to everyone's experience of love, everyone's experience of being, of hearing their parents' voice come out of their mouths, or their parents' gestures come out of their hands. And then for people who've been pregnant, for the experience of another human being coming out of their bodies, which is the most astonishing fact about mammals. It's just astonishing. The wonder of that. And really the
the
experience
extension
of
of that to say that Moshe or Abraham can do that for me. That's a little bit unconvincing.
I hear you. I hear you. I hear what you're saying. But basically I'm trying to give analogs in our daily experience. I mean, one way to say, look, if who I am is partly my internalization of my parents, which is undoubtedly true, and Freud describes this at great length, who they were was internalization of their parents. And who they were is internalization of their parents. And so on back to who was the first Homo sapiens, Lucy in East Africa. I mean, it isn't, maybe the language of the Tikkun Azor seems supernatural, but as a description of human beings and human history, it's actually quite realistic in a way. And I got a laugh the other day. They found what they said was the first cooked meal, but then they found one that was much older. The first cooked meal, there was some report they found was 70,000 years ago, found in, I don't know, Mesopotamia or somewhere in Iraq, basically, or maybe it was in Israel. I don't remember, somewhere in the Middle East. And what was the first cooked meal was pancakes. And I thought, oh my God, pancakes, I love pancakes. And all I have to hear next is they found a little bottle of maple syrup next. So they found these 70,000 remains of 70,000-year-old pancakes. And they actually, the scientists, I don't know how scientists do this, they actually figured out what was in them and they actually made them. They said they're quite good, actually. It was basically made out of crushed seeds, And I thought, oh wow, and it's Vermont, maybe a little ancient jar of Vermont maple syrup. Anyway, but that idea that who we are is a transmission of generations is a very realistic idea. Whether we use this language of sparks or whatever is a whole different thing. But by the way,
that's pretty convincing. I like this idea that the parents are and their parents are in them and their etc. going back all the way to Adam. Okay, fine.
And for better or worse, I mean, certainly the idea of intergenerational trauma is a standard idea in psychotherapy, right? So it could be for good, or it could be for ill, depending on what's being transmitted. But by the way, something I really have to mention is there's a novel called The Kabbalah of Stone by Irene Reddy that talks about ibbur, in which Hulda the prophetess becomes an ibbur in these people living in Spain in the 15th century, 14th century. Really great novel, and I really recommend it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Yael, you have something to say?
Yes, I do. Two things. One, I just wanted to share an experience that I had at 12 years old when my parents took me to synagogue and I heard the Shema and tears started spilling out of my eyes. And there was no reason for that because my whole extended family did not speak Hebrew. They were all Jewish, but we were very American Jewish. And so I had this experience of my genetic makeup had little Jewish stars on it. And when they heard Hebrew, they started coming out of my tear ducts. So
that's great.
But I have a theory about I'm just going back to what you said about Hashamayim tzarich otanu. The heavens need us. We're in a cooperative relationship. And so I think that theory is very interesting, and it spills into some prayers like Aleinu l'Shabeach. But also I wanted to ask you if the idea of tzimtzum, the idea of God shrinking God's self or making God's self less dense so that there would be room for humanity, I'm wondering if the tzimtzum was a plan that God had, that God was going to withdraw some of godliness so that we could be in this reciprocal relationship. That was the overall plan. God filled everything, and then God made this other entity, which was Adama Kadmon, and we're all cells of Adama Kadmon, and that would be, hopefully would have will and would work towards helping heaven.
That's a beautiful statement of it. For people who aren't aware of this idea of tzimtzum, it is in that form. It was really developed in the 16th century by Isaac Luria and his students in a very, very complicated way. It appears there's one reference to it in a 13th century work by Nachmanides, actually. And the verb, l'tzamtzem, actually already appears in rabbinic text, but in a very different, with a very different meaning, where it says that God contracted his presence between the two cherubs on top of the ark. Now that's a very different use of the word tzimtzum, but this idea of tzimtzum that Yael just described so beautifully, again, received its most sort of influential elaboration in Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century. And then people have ruminated on it for the last 400 years or 350 years, and have come up with lots of different takes on it. So the one Yael gave was very beautiful, this idea of its being possibility of of a reciprocal relationship, say an I-thou relationship, for God to constrict the overwhelming divine presence. And then people more recently have used it as an image for all human relationships. In order to actually talk to somebody, you have to give them, we say in common American parlance, give them space, right? Well, the idea of giving them space, I mean, it could literally be taken from the Lurianic text that say basically the first creation was the creation of nothingness, interestingly enough. In the traditional idea, influenced by Greek philosophy, it's yesh me'ayin, the something out of nothing. But the Kabbalists had the exact opposite, creation of nothing out of something, where there's only divine being. The first creation is the creation of nothingness, the ayin, or the halal hapanui, the empty space, literally the empty space. So people have used it in that way as a description of a good human relationship in which you have to limit your own, you don't take up all the space, as we say in American slang, right? In order to let the other person breathe. There are other interpretations as well. I mean, many people take it as an image of exile. That's a divine exile. And it's really, Gershom Scholem thought it was all about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the exile of Spain and divine exile as an empathic relationship with Jewish exile, or a myth of divine exile to try to explain Jewish exile. There are all kinds of ways in which people have taken it in Hasidic literature, in modern sort of neo-Hasidic or neo-Kabbalistic ideas. It's a very, very powerful idea. Yeah, so Beth, you had your hand up.
Yes, I was just thinking about methods of verification. And I'm retired now, but I used to work in a scientific field. And there are times when I would wake up from a dream early in the morning, and I would have an insight about how I needed to approach a project, or I would make connections between facts that I knew, and there were facts that I was always trying to discover about a given project or job site. And my unconscious mind would somehow make those connections for me as I dreamt. And I'm aware from having read stories, from talking to other people in science, and also reading stories in the popular press, that there are a lot of people in different scientific disciplines who have had these same kind of experiences, where they will have a sudden flash of insight, and they have a sudden understanding about, okay, this is where I need to go. And then, because it's scientific endeavor, you then proceed to form a hypothesis and then test it. But we don't conduct our whole lives as if they are science projects normally. That's a niche endeavor. And I think that, at least I can imagine, the Kabbalists engaging in prolonged periods of deep contemplation, and then things unfold to them, not unlike me waking up at 4:45 in the morning and I've suddenly figured out, okay, these are the kind of samples I need to collect at this site. And it's a different kind of knowing. It's almost like a revelation, almost like, I don't know enough about psychology to know if anything in Jungian psychology has ever been verified by anybody. But, they have that idea about the collective unconscious. And I don't know if there is such a thing, or if it's just kind of a cool idea. It could be either. It could be nothing, or maybe there's something to it. But I think we have a way of tapping in as human beings. And maybe it's just that, our neurons are working during our rest period and allowing us to have these visions or revelations. But it's part of how our minds work in the world. And I think it's a method of verification, or at least a method of approaching what could be true, or might be true, or even is probably true. And in different endeavors, like the scientific type, I didn't just have my revelation and then get up and go to work and write my report. I had to go out and collect data to back it up. But not all human endeavors lend themselves to that type of a factual approach. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think that simply the deep contemplation itself is an avenue into truth and verification and some level of certainty about these things. Devotee.
Thank you for that. By the way, your reference to the collective unconscious, I was myself contemplating the midrash about Adam. Adam was arrayed as a inert body, and then God showed him all these things, right? And that phrase, arrayed as an inert body, and very hard to translate. It's mutal golem, and I tried to find any other context in Jewish writing in which this phrase appears, and in traditional Jewish writing, and I haven't found one. But so I was, walking up and down the beach this weekend, and I was thinking, why mutal golem? Right? Why did he show it to him before he breathed the soul into him? Right. And I was walking up and down with my wife, and we were just like, I was saying, why then? Why not breathe the soul into him and then showed it to him? And one thing that come up was, a collective unconscious. It's actually the phrase that came up in my mind was, it's interesting that he showed it all this to him before he breathed the soul into him. And my wife said, well, maybe because otherwise it would have taken away, like it was like unconscious, and then there wouldn't be freedom, there wouldn't be human history if he knew everything and everything was already foretold. It's like that Jewish myth about how before you're born, you know everything, and then an angel touches you and you forget everything, right? Which is also related to Plato's idea of, actually that's probably taken more or less directly from Plato's idea of all knowledge is recollection, right? And that idea that when Adam Golem, when he was raising, that's when God showed him all of human history, right? It's something very powerful about that image, and I think hooks up to this idea of the collective unconscious. By the way, on this question of verification, I think I want to say two things. One is, it's clear that these texts refer to experiences, and it's a characteristic of Kabbalistic texts, unlike mystical texts from other traditions, that the personal accounts are rare. They exist, but they're rare. But it's clear when you read these texts, there's no way to read this text and not realize that there is all this personal experience going on. Certainly these texts about ibbur, it's clear that there's a practice of ibbur going on in Sfat in the 16th century, and they're doing it. They're doing certain kinds of commandments and rituals in order to induce spirits to enter into them. I don't think there's any question about that. It's unfortunate for us that all that stuff has been lost because it's orally transmitted. But that is certainly a big part of it. The idea of oral transmission, of the practices being transmitted orally, is certainly one way in which it's verified through experience. And the other thing I want to say is, it's through the text. The Kabbalists write, especially those writing in the Zoharic tradition, they insist on writing through the precursor texts. They take the Bible, they take the rabbinic literature, and they write through those images. They don't invent, a completely different language. They always say, and as it is written, and they quote some verse. And you look at the verse and you think, that's not what that verse is talking about, right? But they insist on doing that. And the verification is, can they succeed in infusing these verses with their meaning? And if you study the Zohar for long enough and obsessively enough, like yours truly, you begin to think, yeah, that is what that verse means. What else could it mean? That's when you know you've really got it. It's like that moment in My Fair Lady, right? Where they say, by George, I think she's got it, right? Or it's like that moment when you learn a foreign language and you realize that when you're speaking the foreign language, when you're not translating, when you're just speaking it. As long as you're still translating in your head, you're not really speaking the language. You're speaking English, but using foreign words. You're doing it when you're not translating, or even better, when you start dreaming in the foreign language. Then you really got it, because it's gone into your unconscious. And I think that for the Kabbalists, by writing into the traditional texts, they're trying to get you to a point where that's how you read the traditional text. Now, for me, I have a lot of science is something that's above my pay grade. I was never good at math or science, never liked it. But so I know a lot of people try to relate Kabbalah to scientific images, and more power to them. It doesn't speak to me. It's not my language, but my language is the language of the traditional texts, right? And something that Moshe Cordovero, one of the great Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 16th century, he used to wander around the hills with his teacher, which was his teacher, his colleague, Shlomo Alkovitz, and they would propose a verse, some verse from the Bible, and then they would start riffing on it Kabbalistically. And there's actually a slim volume that records some of those conversations called Sefer HaGerushin, which means sort of the book of the expulsions. They would expel themselves from the city like the Shekhinah in exile, and they'd go wander around the hills, right? And one of them would pose a verse, and then they would start infusing it with Kabbalistic meaning. And what's wonderful about this book is you can sort of see it happening. You see how they're inventing it. And I think for them, the verification is whether they can succeed in infusing the traditional texts with this new, or this, this other meaning. So I'll leave that with that. Yeah. And Jesse, did you wait? Is just he left? Oh no, yeah, you are. You're right there. Did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I'm not sure that it still pertains, but Yael mentioned Tzimtzum.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how Tzimtzum relates to gilgul neshamot?
It's a good question. It relates. I'm going to relate it by analogy. I'm not saying that I'm not sure that the connection is made in the text, but I'll relate it by analogy. You may be aware that in Isaiah Tishby, who's one of Shalom's principal students, wrote a book about Lurianic Kabbalah, great book that apparently has recently been translated into English. I'm not sure if it's actually out yet or not, about the doctrine of evil in Lurianic Kabbalah. It's a slim book. It's really a fantastic book. It's really how I learned Lurianic Kabbalah from this book. Tarat Harava Klipa Kabbalat Hari. And he argues that the whole myth of Tzimtzum, the whole thing of Tzimtzum was about divine catharsis. It was about the expulsion of bad stuff from within the divine, the schmutz in the divine. And there are these texts from Ibn Tabu about the achirut, which is achirut. The technical translation of achirut is schmutz. That's what it is, schmutz. And it's the expulsion. That's what causes tzimtzum. It's a cathartic impulse by the divine, and the whole process of unfolding tzimtzum and the emanations and the breaking of the vessels and the whole thing is this process of catharsis and of expelling the sort of the schmutz. In my book on the Sitra Achra in the Zohar, tries to see that kind of process in the Zohar itself. Now, by analogy, right, gilgul in the text we just read is precisely that. It's precisely a process of divine catharsis. Now, it's not. This is just a functional comparison. I'm not comparing the process of Tzimtzum to the process of gilgul, but they have the same function, which is the purification of the divine. And that's as much as I can say about it right now. I'd have to think about it more and see if there's any stated connection in the Lurianic text. I don't know. So I'll leave it at that. But certainly that idea of divine purification is what they share. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Last question, Sharon?
It's not really a question. I was just thinking about some of the things Beth was saying. And I guess for me, the context where I could understand the ibbur is in the artistic creative process. Mm-hmm. I think, and talk about tzimtzum. I mean, for me, I'm a poet, and those times when I can contract and we talk about this sort of becoming a channel, or I think about other poets, you listen, you read Keats and you can hear the echoes. You can hear, was he inhabited by Milton? Was he inhabited by Shakespeare? I should only be so lucky that, Keats should inhabit me. I actually just wrote a poem about fall, in which I am invoking Keats's most perfect poem, one of the most perfect poems in the whole English language tradition, his poem to autumn. But I guess I can see that as a kind of ibbur that I connect to on my personal level, and I think a lot of artists can feel that sense of being inhabited by. Sometimes it's a living artist, sometimes it's a dead artist. My other question, was, again, would just take us very far afield, was somehow this idea that you were saying that the divine needs purification, and I was having some difficulty with that notion. And then, of course, I started to think about the fracturing of the vessels. That always has bothered me. How did God not know that the vessels couldn't contain the light? How could that be if God has this omniscience, that there's somehow this imperfection in the creation that happened? But that's, anyway, I would love to study Kabbalah with you. Maybe you can tell us in an email how we could continue to study with you. That would be, I would love that. And I have a feeling others might as well.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's a great compliment. I really appreciate that.
Another hand went up like that. Yeah, hands are going up.
On the first point, about the artistic creation, look, the old idea of the muse. What is a muse? I mean, the Greeks have the idea of the muse, right? And I think I may have said this here before, that the Iliad starts off, "Sing, O goddess, the wrath of Achilles," right? That's the first line of for arguably the first literary work in the Western tradition. "Sing, O goddess," right? He's trying to channel the goddess. And the other thing about that, what you say about Sing Sum, Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, he used Lurianic Kabbalah to describe exactly what you're talking about. In the English poetic tradition, the relationship between Milton and his successors.
But he talks about it in an agonistic way, which I have a hard time with. I think that's very male. He sees it as extremely Oedipal. It doesn't leave room for the woman artist and for I think for male artists who are not caught up in that agonizing struggle. I see it more as love. I have problems with Bloom.
I hear you. I totally hear you. I totally hear you. But I just felt like I should mention Harold Bloom, since he's the guy who applied this stuff to the poetic process. But I think what you're saying is very true, and I'm sure Bloom talks about the muse, how he sees the Greek muses and how he understands that in terms of his sort of framework of struggle and as you say, very Oedipal and very male. No, the second thing. Oh yes, I just want. I mean, obviously it's a big topic, and we're not going to start now. But I think that leaving behind the idea of a divine omnipotence and a divine omniscience is sort of an important first step in really trying to accept Kabbalah on its own terms. Now, the Kabbalistics often try to cover their bases. They say, well, like the thing about emanation, how did God not know that vessels were going to break, right? I mean, so in one page in this Lurianic text says, the divine emanator, broke the first vessel, but then he thought, well, maybe the second vessel won't break. So he emanated a second one, and it broke. And then he thought, maybe the third one won't break, and so on and so forth. And then 2 pages later, it says, actually, it was all planned out from the beginning. So it's clear that the author of the text first gives you the myth, in which omnipotence and omniscience is really, it's like the whole thing doesn't work if you retain that idea. But then almost sort of remembers, oh my God, well, somebody's going to accuse me of being a heretic or something, and then sort of gives this sort of lame thing. Actually, it was all planned out in advance. But I think that the idea that God needs human beings is a deep Kabbalistic idea. It's also in the Talmud, right? And maybe we'll end on this, right? There's a story in the Talmud, and I like this story because I write a lot about anger in Kabbalistic tradition. But there's a story in the Talmud of it says, and I'll end on this. It says God prays, and it says, what does God pray? And it says, this is what God prays. He prays, may my mercy prevail over my anger. That's what God prays. Okay, so it says that, right? And then it says, and it actually, there's a story, right? What I love about this is talking about verification. I see Jeffrey's not here, but talking about verification. So they make this statement: God prays, may my mercy prevail over my anger. And then it says, and there was a story. And it actually happened. And here's how it was verified. Rabbi Ishmael, who was the high priest, went into the Holy of Holies to offer the incense offering on Yom Kippur. And he goes into the Holy of Holies, and there he sees God sitting on a throne. Right? Or he sees the divine figure. It's called Akachiel Yah Hashem Tzvaot, sitting on a throne. And God says to Rabbi Ishmael, Ishmael, my son, bless me. And Ishmael says to him, may your mercy prevail over your anger. And it goes on a little bit, that the prayer, but exactly repeating the formulation of what God prays about himself. And then Yishmael says it to him, and God nods. Right? Now that, where God nodding and basically saying, yes, you've given me exactly the help that I need, the blessing that I need. So this idea that God needs human blessings goes back, it's in the Talmud, right? It's not a kabbalistic invention, right? And for people who know the Jewish liturgy, that story, and so that's a verification, right? It was a Talmudic statement. How do you know? Well, because it happened to Rabbi Yishmael, right? That story is alluded to in the song Anim Zmira, which is sung in many synagogues on Saturday at the end of the morning prayers, the Musaf, and other liturgies. It's sung at various other times. And it was written by mystics in Germany in the 13th century, in the early 13th century, the so-called Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious of Ashkenaz, who was a school of mysticism around the Rhine River. And that's where Anim Zmira comes from. And at one of the very last lines, it says, "Ubebirchati t'na'na li rosh," and with my blessing, you will nod your head to me. And that is an allusion to that Talmudic story. Now, and it's an amazing moment because that song, Anim Zmira, which is a mystical poem, when I was a little kid, it was something that was led by a child. Because I was Orthodox, so it was led by a boy. So, and it was like responsive. So the boy would sing one line and the congregation would sing the next line and so on. It's a very, very long poem. And it was kind of a fun thing. It was a little kid and it was a whole big challenge. Could you do it when you're a little kid? Before bar mitzvah. But the idea that it was a mystical thing, I didn't realize it until I became an adult. And then one of the last lines alludes to this wild story in the Talmud, where he goes and he sees God sitting on a throne and God needs his help and he nods to him. And with my blessing, you will nod your head to me. And then it goes on, the rest of the line is, and you will take it to you like the besamim, the spices of the head. And it's basically an allusion to the story, which is about the incense offering. So that line in the poem is a direct reference to the story. And I think that on this note, I will end, I love doing this kind of teaching, and I missed it. I actually hadn't done it for about a year because I've been busy. And I actually asked Risha if I could teach one of these courses. I really, really miss it. I love this interaction. I love the kind of people take these courses. So I'll definitely do another one sometime. I have no plan right now, but I'll do another one sometime soon. So I thank you all for being such wonderful interlocutors. And I wish you happy Hanukkah and happy New Year and all that. So,
Happy Hanukkah. May you experience the organuz.
there you go. You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.